This is an open letter to my pink-skinned friends. Uh, Over time, during conversation, a matter has come up in which uh, many of my pink-skinned friends have claimed that something to the effect that we didn't invent slavery. We are not the only ones who, were involved in slavery of other races, and slavery was had long been practiced uh, before we came into the scene with regards to slavery in Europe and slavery in North America and South America. Uh, yes and no, it would be my response. Slavery in the shape and form that was practiced in North and South America and wherever else European pinkskins and their descendants went to and took slaves with them. The way it was practiced by European pinkskins and their descendants is a lot different than the slavery that was practiced in the East and in the South before the Europeans came onto the scene. Here's what I mean. That's they're different. To put it simply, slavery in the East and the South, in the old world, we are talking about in Asia and Africa, uh, and in Americas, in when the redskin owned the land. The slavery, the traditional slavery in Asia and Africa, was debt slavery. In contrast to the kind of slavery that was practiced by the pink skin, which was a lot like very organized chattel slavery. Uh, here's how I can break it down. I give you a personal example. My family at one time owned a slave, and at one time they gave me up for slavery. Uh, to break it down, I'm from a shithole in the Middle East, and when my family was living in the capital of that country, shithole in the Middle East, they were doing okay. They weren't doing great financially, but they were doing okay. So what happened was a family who were not doing so good. They were living in some far-flung village in that country. They weren't doing so good. So the father of the family was had too many children, and he could not take care of all of them, feed and shelter and educate them, and blah blah blah. Forget about education. He couldn't feed and shelter them. So what happened was he gave up one of his children. It was a girl. It was a teenage girl who was given up to my family. As in, like, here is my girl. She's a teenager. Let's say 13, 14, whatever. She can come and live in your house, and you take care of her. You feed her and clothe her, and do your best to educate her. At that time, I mean, there wasn't a question of sending the kid to school. We were talking about 60, 70 years ago, in the 1950s, between 40s and 50s. So at the price of feeding and sheltering the teenage girl at your house, you go ahead and have her work for you. That's pretty much the same setup that the plantation owners had with the black slaves. the pink skin plantation owners had the same setup with the brown skin slaves in North and South America. At the price of feeding and sheltering the slave, which wasn't very good, but still at the price of feeding and sheltering the slave, they had the slave work for them, which was the same setup in my family. At the price of feeding and sheltering the teenage girl, my family had the girl wash and clean and help raise the kids. And but here is the catch. Here is the catch. When this girl no longer needed my family's help in feeding and sheltering her, that is to say, a guy came by from her village back home, told her family that he wants to marry her. So they sent message that we have found a husband for her who's willing to take her to his house, and she would, she would be his wife, and she no longer needs your family our family to feed and shelter her. At that point, she basically left, sat down, thank you very much, and she was like 17, 18, around that age. So it was totally, it wasn't sort of like, okay, here is your slave, I sell the slave to you, and here is the price, and here is a contract, and you sign the contract, and from this day on you own the slave. No, it was more or less voluntarily. It's a voluntarily kind of slavery, a debt slavery. As long as I'm in your debt for feeding and sheltering me, I will work for you. Once I can take care of myself, or once I find somebody else to take care of me, I no longer will be with you, I will move on. That's a debt slavery, and that's what have been practiced for thousands and thousands of years in the East. Families with too many children, when the times were good, they were reproducing and having many children, but when the times were bad, they would give one or more of their children up that they couldn't feed and shelter to families who were doing better, and in effect those children would become slaves of the wealthier family who was doing better. But it was, again, it wasn't like with a contract and with limitless until death do us part, and it wasn't like that. It was voluntarily. And many a times, if it was a male child, as soon as the male child picked up some kind of skills, and who could have, feed and shelter himself, he would move on from his owner's house to be on his own. And if it was a girl, again, as soon as she would find a husband, she would, declare that I no longer want to be a slave in your house. I will become a slave in my husband's house. That's the way things were then. So, and the reason the father in a family could take these decisions, giving up the children to other people as slaves, was because the women and children in a household were considered as the property of the man. So either the man would use the children on his own field, to build up his own wealth and feed and shelter the children, or give the children off to somebody else to, for the price of their work in somebody else's home, they would feed and shelter. Again, it's a kind of slavery. It is slavery. For the price of feeding and sheltering a kid, you are, the kid is doing work for you. The youngster is doing work for you. But it's not limitless. It's not until death do us part. It's until you're willing to, until the slave, the worker, the slave is willing to continue and doesn't have any other choice, which is, in contrast to the way the pink skin and their descendants in North America and South America treated their black slaves as if like Okay, I owe you since you're born, and you cannot leave. In fact, if you do leave, we're going to hunt you down and bring you back, either dead or alive, because I own you. I own hers. I own the contract on you. I own your registration. I have registered you. Such and such an auction house has registered you. You see, these things doesn't happen in the West. The slavery in the East. The slavery in the East was basically a substitute for adoption, in which you can't. There wasn't the concept of adoption so much as it was the concept of, okay, if you can't feed and shelter your children, you give it to somebody else to raise, and for that, for them feeding and sheltering them, they would have the kid work for them, which is somewhat still practiced in many places in India, Bangladesh, some places in Southeast Asia, still practiced. In Africa, many places still practiced. And the other kind, we can get into detail that also there were some slave auctions, but those were auctions in which they found themselves, a society got into a war with the society next to them. There was a war, and there was a winner and a loser. The men had died, and the winners had these lots of women and children on their hand from the loser side, who were considering at that time that there was no job for women, and of course children could not take care of themselves, and women needed somebody to take care of them because there were no jobs for women. So basically the winning side that was part of the loot. The women and children were part of the possessions of the losing side that have now been, that possession have become the possession of the winning side in the war. So they bring back the women and children, and again, since neither the women nor the children could take care of themselves at that time, so these would be considered as properties without owners. So they take these properties without owners, without a legitimate owner, to auctions. So whoever, hey, if you want to take care of this woman, we're willing to feed and shelter this woman, you can have this woman and his children as your slave. And you read about these stories in your Bible as well, my pink-skinned friends, that all these so many prophets, they all had, beside their wives, they all had these servants and maids, and many of them, in the Bible it says that many of them mated, had children with their maids. And who were these maids? These were, maids that they have purchased from such auctions, slave auctions in the East, in which they were property of somebody because they have lost the war, and these women and children didn't have a legitimate owner. So they were put up for auction to whoever is willing to pay for this whatever price. However, basically was the idea that I as a soldier who won in this war, who participated in this war, and I have been given this woman and child as part of my loot, I can take it home myself, and I can feed and shelter them, and have my way with them as well. With the woman would be my servant, just like Noah, just like a lot of these Moses and a lot of these prophets. They all had maids who they mated with. So I can take this woman and his children to my house and take care of them, and be part of my family, as well as they work for me and they produce for me. Or if I can't afford it, I will take this woman and children, which I have been given as part of the loot as a prize for participating in the war, and we have won the war. I have been given this woman and children as part of a prize to me as a fighter. Now I take it to the slave market and sell it, because I can't afford to take care of them myself. I sell it to a rich guy, and the prices are not high because the rich guy also wants the woman to, add to his inventory. He has a couple of wives. He's taking another wife in, basically purchasing a wife that comes with a couple of children probably already. and add to his they call it harem, add to his inventory of women that he is taking care of, and they're taking care of him and reproducing for him. So it was, slave markets in the East were occasional and usually happen after wars, and usually you couldn't buy men in these slave markets because warriors didn't make good slaves. As it's clear from the gladiators in Rome, the only use warriors have is to have them fight each other. But enslaving a warrior and expecting the warrior to be your slave and to work on the land for you, that's not going to happen. It's something bad is going to happen. The warrior will either kill you or kill himself or both, because you cannot really enslave a warrior. So there weren't many adult men in these slave auctions, and these slave auctions were not permanent, like it was in the North America and South America. It was occasional and usually only after wars where there was a winning side and a losing side. And the winning side, as I said, would take the women and children as part of their prize for winning the war. Now, I should add this, I also was given up as slave myself. To put it simply, that girl that was with my family, she left when she was 17, 18. As soon as a husband was found for her, somebody was willing to marry her, she said, I'm going, thank you very much. She gave actually a notice that as soon as I turned 1 year old, she was working in for our family before I was born. So the idea was, as soon as I turned 1 year old, she would leave and join her husband, get married, and have her own family. So that was the case. So when I was born, we no longer had any slaves in our house. But when I was 13 years old, life continued until I was 13 years old. At that time, my family was still living in that shithole in the Middle East, and the economy was not good. The economy of my family was not good. But I had two uncles who were living in the United States, and the economy of here, of course, was good. We are talking about 1987. So I was sent through a very arduous process. I was sent to the United States to live with my uncles. Now, my uncle's idea was that when I come here and start staying with them in the United States from that shithole in the Middle East, my uncle's idea was that my father would pay for my life, food and shelter and education. But as it turned out, my father was basically had given up. His idea was that I give up my son to you to work him around the house, the same way we use that girl in our house. My father's idea was, okay, you use my son to work around the house for the price of the food, shelter, and education that you provide to him. Which wasn't what my uncles had in mind. And first of all, because it's illegal. It was illegal in the United States to have a kid, a teenager, for the purpose of working around the house for his food and shelter. It was illegal. They got child labor laws. And on top of that, the fact that life in the United States, even at that time, was automated. So there was no need no longer for a dishwasher, because there was a mechanical dishwasher. There is no need for even cutting grass. My uncle had a big riding lawnmower, which with little labor he could cut his own grass. And it was a fun thing to do for him. and vacuuming. Even at that time, my uncles, both of them were doctors, so they had central vacuum in their house, so you don't even had the labor of pulling the vacuum machine around the house. You just hooked up the hose anywhere in the house and you could vacuum it. So it was very little in labor involved in the household even at that time. And with the labor laws and the fact that my uncles never really signed up to have a slave boy in their house, they didn't need to, they didn't want to, and it was more trouble than it was worth, because their life was mechanized, automated. So the liability of this kid in their house was more than its benefits. It cost them more, but with little production because of automation of their life. So I stayed with them for 3 years until they said, we no longer want you here, and have a nice day. They sent me back to Iran. I didn't want to, but I was a child, I was a kid, I was a teenager. I couldn't make that decision. And my point is this: the idea of debt slavery, the idea that, okay, I cannot pay for this, what is my responsibility, my child, my wife, whatever, I give it up to somebody else who can take care of it, and for the price of taking care of this liability, this person will work for them. This has been there for a long time. Yes, this is slavery. You work for the master, and the master provides you with food and shelter and clothing and hopefully a little education. But whenever you or the master are no longer need that service, or you found a better somewhere else, a better income from your own skills, or as a woman who has found a husband, blah blah blah, moves on, and there is no more master-slave relationship, or the master no longer needs the services of a maid or a slave or anything of that sort, and they release the person from their possession, from their authority, from their household. This is much different than the kind of slavery that was taking place in North and South America and other places where the Europeans had taken these other races to use. And it wasn't only the black people. The European pinkskins, wherever they saw any other race, they would attempt to enslave them. There was brown people in there. A lot of Indians were forced into slavery by the British. We feed and shelter you, but you have to work for me. And this is the situation in which, because you're forcing another person to work for you and you don't want to release them from that work, they tried to prevent the slave from getting any kind of education. So because they knew, as long as the slave is totally uneducated and not able to take care of themselves, don't have any skills, I guess, beside picking cotton, if they don't have any other skills beside picking cotton, they will have to be dependent on the master for their food and shelter and health care and all of that. So the whole idea of that the whole slavery business model in the West by Europeans and European pinkskins and pinkskins descendants in North and South America, the whole business model was totally different from how slavery was conducted in the East. Slavery in the East, you can say, more or less was voluntary. Even women who were prize of war, the loot of the war, and they were sold into into somebody else's possession, even they were basically better off as being a maid in a wealthy owner's house, because they didn't have any option. If they weren't a maid in a wealthy owner's house, they would have to become prostitutes, because there was no other job for women at that time. The women are not, are not, didn't have any skills that in the society that was acceptable for them to provide that skill to everybody in the society. They only were allowed to provide their skills in the setting of a household. So that was the East. And whenever the children grew up and they could take care of themselves, they were allowed to leave that master's house. You can say basically in the East it was a rental slavery, and in the West it was ownership slavery. The master owned the slave for totality of his life, and the slave can only be set free only if the master desired it, wanted to set the slave free, or else the slave would be the master's property for life. That's the difference. But in the East, not so much. There were, if the child slaves grew up, picked up skill, got married, they could leave. If they picked up skill and could, stand on their own feet and, do a job that they could feed and shelter themselves, they could leave on their own. It wasn't, it wasn't locked in a chattel kind of slavery that was practiced in the West, with a registration number and written somewhere in some book, some auction house, that this man owns this slave for eternity, which was practiced in the West. This is the difference. My pink-skinned friends, you guys, industrialized slavery. You guys, took it to the end zone, to the maximum, pushed the limit of ownership of one human being by another. It wasn't so much, you didn't so much rent the person for a period that the person could not take care of themselves, but you wanted the person for their entirety of their life. And even if you died, you would, the slaves would be passed on to the next generation, the child of the master, whoever, was replacing the master, and being bought and sold multiple times. I mean, come on, you're treating other human beings just like cattle, with having one head of cow being owned by 4, 5, 6 different owners at different points in time. This is taking slavery to a different level. This is not what was practiced in the East. This is, and still some places it is practiced, but this is not what is or was practiced in the East. In the East, slavery is mostly on the voluntary basis, enslaving people who cannot take care of themselves for a period of time, until both sides are happy or okay, not happy, okay with the arrangement. As soon as they're not okay with either side is not okay with the arrangement, that oral contract is abolished, and the master and slave, they go their separate ways. This is not what was practiced in the West. You see, my pink-skinned friends, there was slavery in the East, and still is, but it's not what was practiced in the West.